The steel doors of the operations center swung open with a heavy groan, and the sharp sound of boots striking the polished floor echoed inside. The briefing room was already filled to capacity, its air heavy with the musk of sweat, leather, and adrenaline. Rows of men in immaculate uniforms sat shoulder to shoulder, their posture rigid, their faces carved with the kind of weariness only combat experience could give. They weren't rookies. Every scar, every hardened jawline, and every glance filled with unspoken memories confirmed that this was a gathering of warriors who had seen the worst of humanity. Navy SEALs lined the front rows, their presence almost intimidating, even in stillness. Their shoulders were broad, their eyes sharp, and their silence louder than words. Behind them, Marines filled the middle seats, restless, tapping their boots against the floor with the impatient rhythm of men who preferred the battlefield to waiting. Toward the back were Air Force officers, more composed, their eyes darting across the room, calculating and observant. The room was an intersection of America's finest, each branch represented, each man certain he belonged in that room of elite warriors. Yet despite their differences, they all shared one thing, an unshakable seriousness. They knew the mission ahead wouldn't be routine. The summons had been urgent, the orders classified. The call had not gone out to just anyone, only the best, only those who had proven themselves in fire and blood. And now they sat in silence, waiting for the man who would tell them why they had been brought together. At the front stood a figure who needed no introduction, the SEAL captain. He was tall, his presence commanding, his uniform decorated with ribbons and medals that spoke of decades spent in war zones around the globe. His jaw was set like stone, his eyes scanning the room as if reading each man's soul. He didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. His very presence did that. He clasped his hands behind his back, letting the silence stretch. Silence in a room full of warriors was a weapon. It forced them to lean forward, to pay attention, to brace themselves for whatever came next. Slowly, deliberately, the captain began to pace across the front, each step measured, each pause intentional. "You've all been called here," he began, his voice deep and steady, "because the mission ahead demands the best of the best. This isn't training. This isn't rehearsal. This is real." The words struck like a hammer. Every man straightened a little more, their attention now absolute. The captain's gaze swept over the room, locking eyes with SEALs who had stormed compounds, Marines who had crossed deserts under fire, and Air Force personnel who had watched battles from the skies. He stopped, letting the tension climb. "We are facing an operation that requires precision," he continued. "Not just strength, not just courage, but the kind of skill that comes from men who have lived through hell and walked out stronger." Emphasis on men wasn't deliberate. It was habitual, born of decades in a military culture where warriors were almost always assumed to be male. No one in the room flinched at the phrasing. It was the norm. The captain's eyes narrowed as he scanned the crowd once more. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Any combat pilots here?" The words cut through the room like a blade. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment, no one moved. The SEALs remained still, their eyes locked forward, each one silently calculating. The Marines exchanged quick glances, but didn't rise. Among the Air Force officers, a few shifted in their seats, as if unsure whether the captain's question even applied to them. A combat pilot. That was a rare breed. And in this room, it seemed unlikely anyone present fit the description. The silence stretched longer, the tension growing heavier with every second. Men glanced sideways, wondering if anyone would answer. The captain's face betrayed no frustration, but his eyes grew sharper, scanning the rows like a hunter searching for prey. He was waiting for someone, anyone, to claim the responsibility. Still, no one stood. The room held its breath. And then, almost imperceptibly, something changed. From the very back row, where shadows pooled along the walls, a figure shifted. At first, it was so subtle no one noticed. Then, with slow deliberation, a chair scraped lightly against the floor. A uniformed figure rose to her feet. It wasn't a towering man with scars and a shaved head. It wasn't one of the Marines who carried themselves like walking mountains. It was a woman. She stood with quiet composure, her uniform pressed to perfection, her posture sharp and unyielding. The fluorescent lights above caught the faint glint of her rank insignia, and suddenly all eyes were on her. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Conversations died before they could begin. The very air seemed to hold still, as if uncertain how to react. No one had expected this. Her movement wasn't loud, yet it was louder than anything else that had happened in the room. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't raise her hand timidly. She simply stood, calm, steady, and undeniable. And in that silence, the shock spread like ripples in water. A woman? Here? In this room of hardened warriors? Whispers began at the edges, hushed but noticeable. Some glanced at her with disbelief, others with curiosity, and a few with poorly concealed smirks, as if waiting for her to sit back down. Surely she misunderstood the question. Surely she hadn't risen because she was a combat pilot. But she didn't falter. She didn't shrink under their stares. She simply stood there, tall, calm, and utterly unshaken. The SEAL captain, who had been so still moments before, turned his gaze to her. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. Not mockery, not disbelief, but interest. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It wasn't empty. It was heavy with the realization that the room was about to change. For the first time in years, these warriors, men who had thought they had seen everything, were about to be surprised. And she was the reason why. The captain's voice rang out with the clarity of a man used to commanding silence. "Any combat pilots here?" The question echoed off the steel walls, sharp and unrelenting, before it dissolved into a stillness so profound, it seemed even the fluorescent lights above dared not hum too loudly. For a moment, the world within that briefing room seemed to pause, suspended between expectation and uncertainty. No one moved. Rows of Navy SEALs sat rigid, their faces carved from stone, their eyes fixed on the captain. These were men trained to react instantly, to leap into action at the faintest signal. Yet now they remained immovable. They were not pilots. Their strength came in silent infiltration, in firefights fought face to face, in missions that relied on stealth and steel nerves. Flying jets into combat zones was not their domain. The Marines in the middle rows shifted restlessly. One tapped his boot against the floor, the sound loud in the otherwise suffocating quiet. Their training had taught them to respond to any challenge, but here, the captain's question seemed to pass them by. Combat pilots weren't born in the mud and grit of Marine boot camps. They were forged in cockpits, thousands of feet in the air, where every second carried life or death consequences. And in the back, the Air Force officers kept still. Their eyes flickered toward one another, hesitant, as though weighing whether anyone among them was bold enough to answer. They had flown missions, yes, but combat pilot meant something more. It meant not just flying, but surviving through storms of anti-aircraft fire, dogfights against enemy planes, and impossible missions where success meant threading the needle between death and disaster. It was a title that carried weight, one not claimed lightly. Seconds ticked by, dragging into eternity. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on every chest like an invisible weight. The silence was no longer just absence of sound. It was expectation. It demanded someone step forward. But no one did. The captain's eyes narrowed. He had seen this hesitation before. Not fear, exactly, but calculation. Men reluctant to overstate their worth, to claim a title they hadn't earned in the raw sense of combat. And yet, he knew, for this mission, he needed that very title. A combat pilot. Someone who had looked death in the face from inside a cockpit and chosen to fly into it anyway. Anyone? He repeated, his voice cutting sharper now, more commanding. Still, the silence held. The men in the room began glancing at one another. A Marine sergeant leaned slightly toward his neighbor, whispering something quickly, before catching himself and falling silent again. A SEAL in the front row allowed his eyes to flick briefly toward the back, curious if anyone, would rise. And then the doubt began to creep in. Was this a trick question? A test? Military leaders sometimes used silence to expose weakness, to see who would crack under pressure. Perhaps no one was supposed to answer. Perhaps the true test was obedience, patience, discipline. The stillness grew heavier. A bead of sweat slid down the side of one man's face, though the room was far from hot. The captain's gaze roamed, steady and unyielding, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a move. And yet, beneath the surface, something else was brewing. It began as the faint scrape of a chair leg against the floor, soft, almost drowned out by the hum of the air conditioning. Heads turned instinctively toward the sound. The noise came from the back of the room, where shadows pooled against the walls, and the figure seated there had remained mostly invisible until now. A figure was rising. At first, few could tell who it was. The light above flickered once, throwing the room into brief dimness before stabilizing again. When it returned, the figure was standing fully upright, steady and composed. It was not what anyone expected. A woman. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to stop breathing. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, her insignia glinting faintly under the lights. Her posture was flawless, military through and through, but there was something different about her presence. Unlike the men around her, who radiated intensity through broad shoulders and clenched jaws, her strength was quieter, controlled, almost unsettling in its calmness. She didn't announce herself loudly. She didn't thrust her hand upward or shout over the silence. She simply stood, letting the act itself speak. And it spoke volumes. Every head turned, some in disbelief, others in curiosity. Whispers flickered like sparks. Did she? Is she serious? She can't be. But no one dared speak above a whisper, for fear of breaking the fragile tension now hanging over them. The SEAL captain's eyes locked onto her. His face betrayed nothing, but his attention was absolute. In that moment, she was the only person in the room. The woman stood tall, her chin lifted slightly, her expression calm but unyielding. Her eyes, dark and steady, did not flicker under the weight of dozens of skeptical stares. She wasn't here to seek approval. She wasn't here to prove herself through words. She was here because she belonged. Yet the disbelief in the room was palpable. To many, the idea seemed absurd. A female combat pilot in this room, among SEALs, Marines, and hardened warriors? It was almost unthinkable. But the longer she stood, the harder it was to dismiss her. Something about her composure, the quiet confidence, the refusal to shrink, began to unsettle the assumptions rippling through the crowd. She didn't have to say a word. Her very presence challenged every unspoken rule, every ingrained belief. And though no one would admit it aloud, every man in that room was waiting for her next move. The silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of anticipation. The captain let the moment linger. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss her. He simply studied her with the same unblinking intensity he had used on everyone else. But there was something different in his gaze now, something sharper, as though he were testing her resolve without words. Would she sit back down under the weight of their doubt? Would she falter, crack, retreat into the shadows? She didn't. Instead, she remained standing, every muscle of her body held in disciplined control, every second a declaration that she was exactly where she belonged. And in that unwavering stillness, the room began to realize something extraordinary. The question that had stilled the room had finally been answered, not by the man they expected, but by the woman they never saw coming. The scrape of her chair against the polished floor had seemed almost insignificant, yet in the silence of the briefing room, it struck like a thunderclap. Heads swiveled. Dozens of hardened eyes, trained to detect the faintest hint of danger, now fixed on the single figure who dared to rise. She stood without hesitation, as though she had prepared for this exact moment, though no one could have predicted it. Her presence was quiet, but not small. There was a gravity to her movement, as if she carried with her an invisible weight, not of doubt, but of certainty. Her uniform was impeccable, every crease sharp, every button polished. But uniforms were deceiving. They could make even the greenest recruit appear professional. What set her apart was not the fabric she wore, but the way she wore it, with authority earned, not borrowed. Her posture was a statement. She belonged here. Yet disbelief rippled through the room like a wave. The Marines, restless by nature, leaned forward in their seats, eyes narrowing in scrutiny. To them, combat was flesh and mud, sweat and blood. Could she, this quiet figure, possibly carry the scars that define true warriors? The SEALs remained still, their discipline ironclad, but their silence was different now. They had mastered the art of reading people at a glance, of calculating worth in the set of a jaw, the steadiness of a gaze, the way someone carried their own weight. And in her, they saw something unusual, not weakness, not arrogance, but calm control. From the back row, where Air Force officers sat, a few exchanged quick, incredulous looks. She was one of theirs. That much was clear. But among them, few had dared to rise when the captain had asked for combat pilots. Why her? Why now? And most of all, could she possibly have the experience required to stand in that moment without flinching? The whispers began. She must have misunderstood. No way. Did she actually fly combat? The murmurs slithered through the room, growing louder with each passing second. But she didn't waver. She didn't turn her head or react to the doubtful looks. She simply stood, steady as steel, her hands at her sides, her gaze forward. There was something disarming in her stillness. She wasn't trying to prove herself by speaking. She wasn't demanding recognition. She was simply existing in her truth, letting the weight of her presence carry its own force. The captain, whose authority filled every corner of the room, fixed his eyes on her. His face was unreadable, carved from the discipline of decades. Yet behind that stony exterior, his mind was already turning. He had seen countless men rise with bravado, puffing their chests with exaggerated claims of valor. He had seen them crumble when asked to back their words with proof. But this woman, she hadn't said a word. And yet she held the room in the palm of her hand. He took a step forward. The sound of his boots striking the floor broke the heavy stillness. All eyes followed him, but his gaze never left her. The distance between them was not far, yet in that moment it stretched like a battlefield. He stood as the embodiment of every expectation, every tradition, every unspoken rule that had shaped rooms like this for generations. And she stood as the quiet disruption, the anomaly no one had prepared for. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in disdain, but in measured assessment. "Stand at ease," he ordered. She shifted smoothly, hands clasping behind her back, shoulders square. Her movements were precise, practiced. the kind of discipline drilled through years of training. Yet there was no stiffness, no hint of nerves. The captain studied her for a long moment. The whispers died down. The room held its breath again, waiting for his judgment. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. "You're claiming combat flight experience?" Her answer came with no hesitation. Her voice was clear, controlled, carrying easily across the room. "Yes, sir." The simple affirmation struck harder than a speech. There was no embellishment, no defensiveness, just fact. Some in the room shifted uncomfortably, their doubt gnawing at them. A woman standing in their midst, claiming the title of combat pilot? It clashed with everything they thought they knew about the world they lived in. Yet, as she stood there, unwavering, a subtle shift began to take place. Not in everyone, but in enough. The SEALs, masters of reading truth in silence, leaned back slightly, reassessing. Marines stopped fidgeting, curiosity slowly overtaking skepticism. Even the Air Force officers, who moments ago had doubted her, now studied her more closely, wondering what they had missed. The captain tilted his head slightly, as though weighing her resolve. Then he asked the question that would strip away any pretense, any false claim. Name, unit, missions flown. The room went silent again. This was it. The crucible moment. If she faltered now, if her answers carried hesitation or gaps, the fragile respect beginning to form would collapse instantly. She inhaled once, slow and steady. Then she spoke. "Lieutenant Commander." Her name. Air Wing 2. 42 combat sorties flown. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Evacuation and precision strike missions under hostile fire. Her words were sharp, precise, each one dropping like a stone into the silence. No bravado, no dramatics, just the truth. And the truth was heavier than doubt. The murmurs stopped. The disbelief faltered. What replaced it wasn't yet admiration, but it was something stronger than ridicule. It was attention. The SEAL captain's gaze didn't waver, but a flicker, so subtle most would have missed it, passed across his eyes. It was recognition. He knew the weight of what she had just claimed. He had worked alongside pilots before. He understood the razor's edge between life and death in hostile skies, the kind of courage it took to keep flying when enemy fire filled the air. The room, once doubtful, was changing. Not all at once. Not completely. But the foundation had cracked. And it had started with nothing more than a quiet movement. The silence that followed her words was not the same silence that had filled the room before. Earlier, the quiet had been suffocating, heavy with doubt, pressing down like a storm about to break. Now, it was different. It was the kind of silence that came after a fault line split the ground, an uneasy, stunned stillness where everyone knew something had shifted, even if they didn't want to admit it. She stood there, calm and composed, the weight of her record hanging in the air like smoke from a battlefield. 42 combat sorties. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, missions under hostile fire. Words that carried not just information, but scars. Each one was a blade cutting through the disbelief that had greeted her rise. Yet disbelief was stubborn. From the middle rows, a Marine sergeant leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. His eyes flicked toward the man beside him, as if to say, "She's exaggerating. Maybe she was part of a crew, maybe she flew supply runs, but combat?" His skepticism was written across his face as clearly as the stripes on his sleeve. Another Marine, younger and more impressionable, frowned slightly, torn between loyalty to his assumptions and the undeniable steadiness of the woman before him. He wanted to doubt. It was easier that way. But something about her posture, her voice, made the doubt harder to cling to. The SEALs were less expressive, They did not smirk. They did not whisper. They simply watched. But theirs was not the watchfulness of idle curiosity. It was the kind of scrutiny born of survival, of needing to know whether the person beside you could be trusted in the darkest, bloodiest moments. And though they said nothing, their silence was beginning to shift. They had heard men boast of medals and honors that rang hollow once tested. This woman, though, she wasn't boasting. She was simply telling the truth. The Air Force officers, who moments ago had shared looks of disbelief, now found themselves staring at her with something far more complex: recognition. They understood what 42 sorties meant. They understood what under hostile fire implied. They had read reports of pilots who never returned from fewer missions than that. And though pride twisted some of their faces, pride that one of theirs had risen in such a room, there was also unease. Why her, and not them? Why had they stayed seated while she stood without hesitation? The whispers grew again, but they were different now. No longer dismissive, no longer laced with ridicule. She's serious. Did you hear what she said? 42 sorties. Hostile fire. Damn. The room, which only minutes before had been a fortress of assumptions, was beginning to crack. But cracks are not collapses, and resistance remained. The Marine sergeant leaned forward now, his voice just loud enough to carry to his neighbor, but not to the captain. "Let's see her prove it," he muttered, a trace of derision curling around the words. To him, her standing wasn't enough. Her record wasn't enough. She was still a woman, and in his mind, that meant there had to be an explanation, some loophole, some exaggeration. Yet even he couldn't look away from her. Even he couldn't deny the steadiness with which she held herself, the quiet defiance in her eyes. The captain, who had allowed the murmurs to rise unchecked, raised his hand slightly. Instantly, the whispers died. Authority wrapped around the room like chains, binding every tongue. He took a step closer to her, his boots echoing against the floor, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but edged with steel. 42 sorties, he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. Hostile fire. Yes, sir, she replied, her tone unflinching. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching, dissecting. Then he asked the question that everyone else in the room was too hesitant to voice. Why didn't you hesitate to stand? It was a deceptively simple question, but in the room, it landed with the force of a hammer. Every man knew what he was really asking. What makes you think you belong here? Her answer was just as simple, but it carried the weight of everything she had lived through. Because you asked for combat pilots, she said evenly. And I am one. The words struck the room harder than a shouted speech ever could. There was no defensiveness, no arrogance, no attempt to convince. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same calm certainty she had shown since she stood. For the first time, the captain's lips twitched, not into a smile, but into something close. A recognition, a sliver of respect. He gave a short nod, more to himself than to her, then stepped back, turning his gaze once more to the room at large. Any other combat pilots? He asked, his voice carrying the same weight as before. The question hung in the air, daring others to rise. But no one did. Not the Air Force officers who had remained seated. Not the Marines who had muttered in doubt. Not the SEALs whose silence had been carved from discipline. No one else rose. The realization settled over them like dust after an explosion. The only one who had stood, the only one who had claimed the title without hesitation, was her. And in that realization, the assumptions that had anchored the room began to erode. The Marine sergeant who had smirked earlier now sat straighter, his arms no longer crossed. The young Marine beside him glanced at her again, but this time with something closer to awe than suspicion. The Air Force officers shifted uncomfortably, guilt gnawing at them for their hesitation. And the SEALs, though their expressions remained unreadable, had begun to view her not as an anomaly, but as a potential ally. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Her presence had done what no speech, no lecture, no argument could have accomplished. By simply standing, by refusing to bend under the weight of disbelief, she had forced them to confront the fragility of their assumptions. Strength was not always loud. Courage was not always obvious. And sometimes, the most powerful act in the room was the quietest one. The captain let the silence linger once more, though this time it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't doubt. It wasn't resistance. It was recalibration. A room full of men, seasoned by war, was recalibrating its understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. And she was the reason why. The captain stood unmoving, his gaze fixed on her with the weight of a man who had spent decades separating truth from bravado. In rooms like this, claims were easy. Men could puff their chests, decorate their words, and hope the sheer force of confidence would make them believable. But the captain wasn't fooled by noise. He had buried too many under false bravado to fall for it again. When he finally spoke, his words were simple, clipped, but heavy with intent. Name, unit, missions. The room inhaled collectively. This was the test. She had stood, claimed the title of combat pilot, claimed experience under fire. Now, stripped of silence, she would be forced to reveal whether her words held weight or crumbled under scrutiny. Her eyes locked on his. Calm, steady. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. When she spoke, her voice carried easily across the room, neither raised nor tentative, just controlled. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kensington, attached to Air Wing 2, Carrier Air Group 7, 42 combat sorties, flown, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, precision strikes, evacuations, escort missions, all under hostile fire. Every word was precise, delivered without hesitation, without flourish. The kind of cadence only truth could carry. The room shifted. The Marines stopped their restless movements, their eyes narrowing not with doubt now, but with calculation. 42 sorties. That wasn't a number you claimed lightly. Every man in that room understood what it meant to tally missions like that. Each one a dance with death, each one carrying the lives of comrades in its balance. The SEALs, still statuesque in their seats, absorbed the details silently. They knew precision when they saw it. They knew the difference between someone trying to convince and someone simply reporting facts. And her words, crisp, measured, exact, rang with the cold sharpness of fact. Among the Air Force officers, the whispers died completely. They knew what it meant better than anyone. They understood the gauntlet of training, the brutality of combat flight, the razor-thin line between success and obliteration. They also knew how few pilots survived to claim such records. For some, guilt twisted in their gut. They had stayed seated. She had not. And now she had proven why. The captain's eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly. Recognition. Not approval yet, but the acknowledgement of truth. 42, he repeated, his voice low, almost testing the word against the air. Yes, sir, she confirmed without flinching. The Marine sergeant who had smirked earlier leaned forward, his expression hardening. No longer dismissive, but unsettled. He wanted to find the crack, the exaggeration, the thread he could pull to unravel her claim. But there was none. Every syllable of her record hit with the weight of someone who had lived it, not someone reciting borrowed glory. The captain stepped closer, his boots striking the floor with deliberate rhythm. He circled slightly, his eyes still on her, as though studying every line of her posture. Afghanistan, he said. What operations? Kunduz, Helmand, Kandahar, she replied, her tone unwavering. Close air support for ground troops. Evacuation escort under heavy fire. Enemy SAM locks on multiple occasions. Completed all objectives. A murmur ran through the room. She wasn't vague. She wasn't hiding behind generalities. She was giving details, specific, verifiable, impossible to fabricate without exposure. Iraq, the captain pressed. Fallujah, Mosul, Tikrit, multi-role missions. Strike packages coordinated with ground assault. Convoys escorted. Engagements under anti-aircraft artillery. No losses under my watch. This time, the silence that followed was heavier. The SEALs understood the gravity. The Marines recognized the names of battlefields where comrades had bled. The Air Force knew the odds stacked against pilots who had flown those skies. Syria, he continued. Aleppo, Raqqa, Eastern Desert Corridor. Precision strikes against fortified targets. Missions flown at night under restricted visibility. Completed with 0 collateral casualties. The captain stopped pacing. He stood before her, expression unreadable. The silence stretched, the weight of her words filling every corner of the room. She did not fidget. She did not break eye contact. She stood as steady as when she had first risen, her entire being carved from the discipline of truth. Finally, the captain spoke. Casualties? Her jaw tightened slightly, the first flicker of emotion since she had risen. But her voice remained steady. 3 wingmen lost. 2 shot down over Helmand, 1 in Raqqa. Rescue efforts unsuccessful. I filed every report personally. The words struck like a blow. She did not soften them, did not hide behind euphemisms. She spoke them with the weight they deserved, each syllable carrying the memory of lives that would never return. And in that moment, even the hardest hearts in the room recognized what her calm exterior concealed, the burden of loss, carried silently, but carried nonetheless. For warriors, loss was the truest currency of authenticity. You could not fake it. You could not invent it. You either bore it, or you didn't. And she bore it. The SEAL captain studied her for a long, unbroken silence. He had buried men. He knew the look of someone who carried ghosts. And in her eyes, behind the discipline, behind the calm, he saw them, not weakness, not regret, but the quiet, unshakable weight of remembrance. The room felt it too. The Marine sergeant who had doubted her now sat with his arms no longer crossed, his gaze steady, but no longer mocking. The younger Marine beside him looked down at his boots, ashamed of the assumptions he had carried moments before. The Air Force officers avoided one another's eyes, chastened by their own hesitation. The SEALs remained silent, but the silence had shifted once again. It was no longer evaluative. It was respect, unspoken but undeniable. The captain's voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but it carried more weight. 42 sorties. Hostile skies. Casualties borne. Records verified. He let the words settle. Then he straightened, his gaze still fixed on her. You've proven your place, he said simply. Her nod was small, controlled, but it carried more power than any boast. She had not come to prove herself. She had not come to shatter their doubts with speeches. She had come because she was asked if any combat pilots were present. And she was one. That was all. But in proving that simple truth, she had done more than establish her credentials. She had forced the room to confront itself, to confront the fragility of its assumptions, to confront the stubbornness of its doubt, to confront the fact that courage, skill, and sacrifice wore many faces, some they had not expected. And as the silence deepened once more, one thing was clear. The weight of her record had broken more than disbelief. It had begun to break the walls that had stood unchallenged for far too long. The room had changed. though no one would admit it out loud. What had started as disbelief and skepticism now hung thick with something new, respect, uneasy, but undeniable. It was in the way the Marines no longer lounged in their chairs, in the way the Air Force officers avoided each other's eyes, in the way the SEALs, stone-faced as always, seemed to lean forward ever so slightly. Sarah Kensington had not moved. She stood as she had from the beginning, calm, controlled, posture straight as a blade. But around her, the air had shifted. She didn't need to force their acknowledgement. The truth had done that for her. 42 sorties. Casualties borne. Missions completed. A record that couldn't be argued with, no matter how much pride or prejudice tried to resist. The captain himself remained silent for a time, as though letting the weight of her testimony settle in the bones of the room. He had pressed her, tested her, and she had not bent. That alone meant something. In a world where many men folded under interrogation, she had stood firm, steady, precise. He respected that, even if he wasn't ready to show it fully. The Marine sergeant, the one who had smirked earlier, was the first to shift openly. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees now, eyes narrowed not with disdain, but with something closer to grudging curiosity. He studied her like an opponent across the ring, someone he had underestimated, and now had no choice but to take seriously. He had seen bravado collapse under fire before. This wasn't bravado. This was iron. Beside him, the younger Marine swallowed hard. His earlier skepticism had melted into something heavier, guilt. He had doubted her instantly, dismissed her before she even spoke. But as she stood there, unwavering, he realized that she carried more combat weight on her shoulders than he could dream of. She had lived battles he had only heard about in barracks stories. The shame sat like a stone in his chest. The Air Force officers were restless. They shifted in their seats, some looking at her, others looking away, each wrestling with their own reflections. For them, the sting was sharp. They had shared the same insignia, the same wings, and yet when the call came, they had stayed seated. Not one of them had risen. Not one of them had dared claim the space that should have been theirs to claim. Now she stood in their place, and though pride swelled faintly that she was one of theirs, shame clung thicker. The SEALs remained inscrutable, as ever. Their discipline kept their faces unreadable, but within their silence was a subtle shift. They had seen many claim titles, many boast of records, and more often than not, time revealed the hollowness behind the words. But she hadn't boasted. She hadn't shouted, demanded, or postured. She had simply answered the captain's questions with precision. That carried weight. Among warriors, respect was not given. It was earned. And though they hadn't spoken it yet, she had begun to earn theirs. The captain finally broke the silence, his voice low, deliberate. "This room is not easily impressed," he said. His gaze swept across the men, then returned to her. "But you've earned the attention you've been given." There was no applause, no outward display of approval. But in this room, silence itself was a kind of respect. Sarah gave the smallest of nods, acknowledging his words, but not basking in them. She hadn't stood to be admired. She had stood because the question was asked, and she had answered. For her, that was enough. But for the others, it was not so simple. The Marine sergeant cleared his throat, the sound sharp against the quiet. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice carrying a mix of reluctance and recognition. "Those numbers, those missions, they're not light work." It wasn't praise, not fully. But it wasn't dismissal either. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement that a hardened Marine like him could offer in a room full of peers. Sarah met his gaze, unshaken. "No mission ever is, Sergeant," she replied. The response wasn't laced with arrogance. It was matter of fact, as sharp and unyielding as the truth itself. The sergeant gave a small grunt, a gesture that, in his world, spoke volumes. From the back of the room, one of the younger SEALs finally broke his silence. His voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of directness that only came from the teams. What was the hardest mission? Heads turned. The question wasn't asked to trip her, wasn't meant as a challenge. It was curiosity, genuine, measured. Sarah paused, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the memories pressed heavy against her chest. She exhaled slowly before speaking. "Kunduz," she said softly. "We were providing cover for an evacuation convoy. Ground troops pinned down, enemy closing in fast. We had SAM locks on us from the moment we entered airspace. I lost 2 wingmen that day. I finished the run alone. Got the convoy out, but I didn't bring my men home." The room went still again, not out of doubt this time, but out of respect for the weight of what she had just shared. Loss was universal in this room. Everyone had carried it. Everyone had buried comrades. In that instant, she was no longer the woman who stood up. She was one of them, someone who had bled in the ways that truly mattered. The young SEAL gave a short nod, his eyes lowering in acknowledgement. Nothing more needed to be said. The shift was complete. The captain saw it too. The resistance that had filled the room at the start was gone, replaced by a grudging, unspoken respect. It wasn't admiration, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. She had earned her place among them, not because she demanded it, but because she proved it. The Marines no longer whispered doubts. The Air Force officers no longer smirked or shuffled. The SEALs no longer watched with suspicion. Each in their own way, they had recalibrated. The captain gave one final look around the room, then back to her. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of finality. "Noted, Lieutenant Commander." "Take your seat." Sarah nodded once more and returned to her chair. She didn't smile. She didn't seek their eyes. She sat with the same quiet strength she had shown when she first rose, as though none of it, the doubt, the scrutiny, the shift, had shaken her. But the room knew better. They had witnessed something rare. A wall had been broken, not with noise, not with force, but with truth. And every man in that room carried the faint, unsettling knowledge that he would not forget the moment the SEAL captain had asked for combat pilots, and the woman who had risen without hesitation. Respect in that room did not come with applause. It did not arrive in the form of cheers, backslaps, or overt words. Respect in a room filled with warriors came quietly, like the steady heat of a fire catching hold. It began in glances, in silences, in the absence of doubt where it had lived only moments before. Sarah Kensington sat in her chair once more, posture straight, eyes forward, face calm. On the surface, nothing about her had changed. She had stood, spoken, endured their scrutiny, and returned to her seat. That was all. But around her, the air told a different story. The Marine sergeant, who had once smirked, now leaned back in his chair with his arms no longer crossed. His gaze, though stern, no longer carried mockery. He studied her the way a boxer sizes up an opponent who has survived the first punishing round. Not an enemy, not even necessarily a rival, but someone who had earned the right to stay in the ring. Beside him, the younger Marine dared another glance her way. His earlier shame lingered, but it was joined now by something else: admiration. He had grown up on stories of impossible missions, of heroes who did the extraordinary under fire. And here, sitting just rows away, was someone who had lived those stories. Not a myth, not a tale, but flesh and blood. It stirred something inside him, the kind of inspiration that no lecture could ever provide. The Air Force officers were the most restless. They shifted in their seats, their pride bruised yet sharpened. Sarah was one of theirs. She carried the same insignia, the same wings. And though they felt the sting of their own hesitation, they also knew that her strength reflected on them. Quietly, they began to reframe her not as the anomaly in the room, but as their standard-bearer. She was the one who had risen when they did not. That truth would haunt them, but it would also make them proud. The seals, silent as ever, betrayed little in their expressions. But their eyes told a story. Warriors knew warriors. They had seen arrogance dressed up as competence before, and they had seen it break under fire. Sarah was not arrogance. She was steel. She was loss carried without complaint, missions completed without fanfare, truth spoken without embellishment. That made her one of them, even if she wore a different uniform. It was the captain, though, who saw the shift most clearly. He had orchestrated it, perhaps unknowingly. By calling out for combat pilots, he had cracked open a door that no one expected her to walk through. And when she had, with quiet confidence, she had forced the entire room to confront itself. That kind of courage could not be taught. It was innate, forged in the crucible of fire and fear, the kind of courage that separated leaders from followers. For a long while, he let the room sit in the weight of what had passed. He wanted the silence to do its work. In silence, men thought. In silence, they reflected. And he knew they would remember this moment not because he commanded them to, but because the truth had commanded it. Finally, the sergeant broke the quiet. His voice was rough, edged with the gravel of a man who had spent too many years barking orders and surviving fights. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, 42 sorties. "You carried your weight." No one can argue that. It wasn't praise in the traditional sense. It wasn't flowery. But in his world, those words were as close to respect as medals pinned to a chest. Sarah inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement but not seeking more from it. She did not need his validation, yet his recognition meant something all the same. One of the younger Air Force officers found his voice next. "You flew in Raqqa?" he asked, disbelief and awe mingling in his tone. "Yes," she answered simply. "What altitude?" "Low, visibility compromised." "Threat levels high," the officer swallowed, shaking his head faintly. "That's insane." His voice cracked into a short laugh, not mocking, but incredulous. Sarah's lips curved just slightly, the ghost of a smile. "So is combat," she replied. A ripple of low chuckles moved through the room, faint but real. It was the first time laughter had dared enter the space since the captain had called for pilots. It was small, but it marked another shift, from tension to familiarity, from doubt to camaraderie. The SEAL captain watched closely. He knew laughter could be a test as much as silence. And Sarah had passed. She hadn't tried to ingratiate herself, hadn't demanded inclusion. She had simply answered with the dry humor of someone who had lived through madness and returned with the scars to prove it. That was the kind of humor warriors trusted, the kind that grew out of survival, not arrogance. From the far side of the room, another SEAL finally spoke, his voice deep and measured. "You carried your team," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Sarah met his gaze. "I tried," she said, "but I didn't carry them all home." The SEAL gave a single nod, nothing more. But in his world, that nod carried more respect than any medal. It was the acknowledgement of shared pain, shared burden. He understood. She understood. And that was enough. The younger Marine, emboldened by the moment, leaned toward her slightly, his voice hesitant. "Ma'am, did you ever think about quitting? About not flying again?" The room stilled, listening for her answer. Sarah paused. She could have said no, could have claimed unwavering courage. But that wasn't the truth, and truth was the only language she spoke. "Yes," she said quietly. "Every time I lost someone. Every time I strapped in and wondered if this would be my last flight. But I flew anyway, because someone had to. The Marine swallowed hard, his face tightening. He nodded slowly, as though he had just been handed a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Respect deepened. The SEAL captain finally stepped forward, drawing every eye back to him. He looked at Sarah, his expression unreadable, but his words carried the weight of a decision made. "Lieutenant Commander Kensington," he said, "you walked into this room with doubt stacked against you. You stood when others stayed seated. You spoke when others questioned. You carried your truth, and you bore it without flinching. That does not go unnoticed here." For a moment, silence reigned again. Then slowly, heads began to nod, the Marines, the Air Force officers, even the SEALs. Not in unison, not dramatically, but naturally. One by one, in their own way, they acknowledged her. Sarah didn't smile, didn't bask in the shift. She simply inclined her head, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you, Captain." And though the room would soon move on, though more discussions and drills awaited, no one there would forget what had transpired. Respect had been earned, not demanded, not gifted, but forged in the fire of truth. And from that moment on, she was no longer the woman who had stood unexpectedly. She was one of them. When the briefing resumed, the air in the room was not the same as before. The captain continued, issuing instructions and laying out operational frameworks, his voice steady, commanding. The men listened, took notes, and nodded the familiar rhythm of orders. On the surface, everything had returned to normal. But beneath that surface, something had changed. Every glance that slid in Sarah Kensington's direction carried the echo of what had passed. The Marines who had once dismissed her now carried their silence differently, no longer laced with doubt, but with acknowledgement. The Air Force officers, though still chastened, sat straighter, prouder, as though her strength reflected on them. The SEALs, quiet as always, had tucked her away into their mental ledger, not as an outsider, but as someone proven. Sarah herself remained as steady as she had been since the beginning. She took her notes, absorbed the captain's words, and gave no outward sign that she had altered the trajectory of the room. She did not need to. She had not stood for glory, had not spoken for validation. She had stood because the call was made, and she had answered truthfully. That was all. And yet, sometimes the simplest acts left the deepest marks. As the session drew to a close, the captain dismissed the group with a sharp nod. "You've got your orders." Dismissed. Chairs scraped against the floor, boots thudded heavily, and the room began to dissolve into clusters of conversation. Men spoke in low tones, some debating logistics, others rehashing details. But woven among the operational talk was something subtler, the lingering undercurrent of what had happened when the captain asked his question. The Marine sergeant, slow to move, lingered near his chair, watching Sarah pack away her notes. Finally, he stepped closer. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the earlier edge. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, "didn't think I'd see the day?" She looked up, calm as always. "The day for what, Sergeant?" He shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, but this time it carried no mockery. "The day someone walked into a room full of us and held their ground like that. You proved me wrong." Sarah gave the smallest of nods. "That's the thing about war, Sergeant. It doesn't care what we expect. It just demands what we have." The sergeant's eyes narrowed for a moment, then softened. He gave a grunt, the closest he ever came to admitting respect, and walked away. The younger Marine, still hovering uncertainly, stepped forward next. His voice carried the hesitation of a man who wanted to speak but feared stumbling over his words. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say—" He paused, then forced the words out. "I hope I get to carry myself like that one day." Sarah studied him, her expression steady, but her eyes held a faint warmth. "You will," she said, "if you keep listening more than you speak." The Marine blinked, then nodded quickly, as though committing her words to memory. From across the room, one of the Air Force officers approached, his movements stiff with pride and unease. He stopped short of her desk, his gaze flicking away before returning to her. "You made us look bad," he said flatly. Sarah tilted her head slightly. "I didn't make you do anything," she replied evenly. The officer gave a short, rueful laugh. "Fair. You reminded us who we're supposed to be. That stings. But it's good." His voice dropped, quieter now. "We'll remember it." Before she could answer, a shadow fell across the desk. One of the SEAL's tall, broad, eyes like stone, stood over her, silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, graveled with years of hard service. "Respect," he said simply. Then he turned and walked away. It was one word, but in that world, it carried more weight than any speech. The room emptied slowly, the men filing out in groups. Sarah gathered her things, unhurried, unbothered. When she finally rose to leave, the captain was still there, standing near the door with his arms folded. He waited until the others had gone before speaking. "You didn't flinch," he said, his tone neither praising nor casual. "No reason to," she answered. "You understand what you did in there?" She met his gaze. "I answered your question." The captain studied her, then allowed the faintest curl of a smile. "You did more than that. You forced them to face themselves. That's a rare thing." Sarah said nothing, only offered the smallest nod. "Carry that with you," the captain said. "They'll remember this day. Not because of me, but because of you." She inclined her head in acknowledgement, then stepped past him and out into the corridor. The hallway was quiet, the sound of her boots echoing against the polished floor. For the first time since she stood, she allowed herself a slow breath, her shoulders easing fractionally. She hadn't sought to change the room, hadn't planned to, but she had known, deep down, that answering the call mattered. Not for her reputation, not for pride, but because sometimes the simplest acts of courage ripple outward in ways unseen. And ripple it would. In the weeks to come, the Marines who had doubted her would recall her steadiness when their own was tested. The Air Force officers would think twice before hesitating when called upon, remembering how she had risen without pause. The SEALs would carry her name quietly, a mark etched into their unspoken ledger of respect. The story would spread, retold in fragments and whispers, each version carrying the same core. The SEAL captain asked for combat pilots. Everyone froze. And she stood. She stood, and she proved it. For Sarah Kensington, it was not legacy she sought, but legacy had found her. The moment would outlive the walls of that room, carried on the tongues of those who had witnessed it, becoming part of the fabric of their collective memory. And long after the boots had marched, long after the operations had changed, one truth would remain. When the SEAL captain called out, "Any combat pilots here?" She rose, she spoke, and she stunned them all.